The fish truck stopped hard at Denise Carter's gate just after noon, its rear tank sloshing under a white Alabama sun. A man jumped from the cab and ran toward her porch, shouting that the oxygen pressure was falling. Owen Brooks, manager of a private catfish hatchery 30 miles away, explained that the buyer had canceled the order that morning, and the truck had developed a regulator problem while he was searching for another pond. Inside, the tanks were roughly 16,500 channel catfish fingerlings, already crowding near the surface. He asked to transfer them into Denise's old 5-acre pond before the entire load suffocated. Denise did not open the gate. She demanded the species record's health paperwork and a written agreement stating who owned the fish and who carried the risk. Owen looked at the pressure gauge and told her they might have less than an hour. Denise called Marcus Hill, an aquaculture specialist with the county extension office. Marcus confirmed the paperwork appeared legitimate and warned that keeping the fish on the failing truck was more dangerous than a controlled emergency transfer. Denise finally unlocked the gate. Hoses were run to the pond, water temperatures were equalized, and the fingerlings poured into a body of water that had not been managed for commercial fish in more than 20 years. As the last tank emptied, Denise's phone buzzed. Her brother Ray had scheduled a land buyer to inspect the lower 28 acres the following week. Owen promised the hatchery would retrieve the fish once another buyer was found. Then he looked toward the silent rusted aerator beside the pond and added, "Until then, they're breathing your water." Denise stood at the pond until dusk, watching small ripples spread where the fingerlings had disappeared. Her father had raised catfish there when she was young, but rising feed costs and failing equipment had ended the operation long before his death. Since inheriting the 63-acre property with Ray, Denise had relied on 18 beef cows and whatever hay the land could produce. 2 poor hay seasons had forced her to buy feed delay fence repairs and use savings meant for property taxes. Ray lived in Birmingham and paid his share of insurance and taxes, but he no longer believed sentiment justified carrying land that did not support itself. The lower 28 acres included the pond, the best road access, and enough pasture to keep the cattle operation connected. Selling that section might give both siblings temporary relief, but it would divide the farm in a way Denise knew could never be reversed. That evening, Ray arrived with a folder of property estimates. He listened as Denise described the emergency transfer and stared at the pond as though she had filled it with debt. "You took 16,000 problems because a stranger asked nicely," he said. Denise reminded him the fish were supposed to be removed. Ray pointed toward the abandoned power pole, the broken aerator, and the weeds growing around the old drain structure. He told her he would postpone signing anything until the end of the production season, but only if she could prove the farm had a new source of income. No shared tax money could be used, and every expense had to be recorded. After he left, Denise opened her father's old pond ledger and found that even in his best year, the fish had required more management than she remembered. By morning, the hatchery still had no buyer. Marcus arrived before sunrise, carrying a water testing meter, sampling bottles, and a depth pole. He chose the early hour deliberately. Denise had checked the pond the previous afternoon and believed the clear surface meant everything was fine, but Marcus explained that dissolved oxygen often reached its lowest point just before daylight. At the shallow western edge, the reading was already lower than he liked. The pond covered close to 5 acres, yet repeated probing showed that years of sediment had reduced its average depth. Denise had been estimating water volume from an old property map, not from what the pond actually held. The electrical service once used for the paddle wheel aerator had been disconnected, and the intake screen near the drain had rusted through. Marcus found no immediate disease signs, but he warned that nobody knew how many fingerlings had survived the transport stress. Owen's paperwork listed the original count, not the living population, now scattered through the pond. Denise asked whether the fish could remain safely for a few days without major investment. Marcus answered with conditions rather than reassurance: limited feeding, daily observation, early morning oxygen checks, and a working emergency aeration plan before the next heat spell. At one corner, the meter showed another drop in oxygen where decaying vegetation had collected. Denise wrote down every number, then called Owen and demanded that the hatchery retrieve the fish, as promised. He said a crew would come the following morning with a seine and transport tanks. Denise felt her first real relief until Marcus looked across the overgrown banks and asked whether anyone had dragged a full harvest net through that pond since her father stopped farming it. Denise admitted no one had. Marcus pushed the depth pole into the mud until nearly half of it disappeared. Owen returned with 2 workers, a transport truck and a seine that had been patched so many times it looked stitched together from several different nets. The plan was to circle the fingerlings, grade them by size, and move them to another buyer's pond. It failed before the first pull reached halfway across. The net snagged on submerged branches, scrap wire, and the remains of an old feeder platform buried near the bottom. Thick grass along the banks prevented the crew from keeping the lead line tight. When they finally brought one section ashore, the catch contained fingerlings ranging from barely 4 inches to nearly twice that size. Owen called 2 possible buyers, but neither wanted an uneven lot after the original contract had been canceled. A processor would not accept them because they were far below market size. Retrieving, grading, and transporting the entire load would require a better net, more labor, and another oxygen-equipped truck. Owen calculated the cost in the shade of Denise's barn and admitted it exceeded what the hatchery could recover from the fish. He offered Denise ownership for $1, 2 pallets of starter feed and written health records. In exchange, the hatchery would have no further responsibility. Denise asked Marcus whether accepting would be reckless. He said the pond could possibly carry the surviving fish at a moderate density, but only with controlled feeding, reliable aeration, and a market plan. Walking away was not simple either. The fish were already in her water, and allowing them to die would create a larger problem. Denise signed the transfer agreement, then watched Owen's empty truck leave. What had entered her pond as someone else's emergency was now entirely hers. Denise approached the fish the way she had once managed a school cafeteria. Every serving, delivery, and wasted pound had to appear on paper. She listed feed, electricity testing, equipment, fuel transport processing fees, ice labor, and expected mortality. The free fingerlings disappeared as an advantage within minutes. Feed alone could consume most of the eventual sales if she guessed the population wrong or kept undersized fish too long. Marcus helped her contact a licensed processor 45 miles away. The plant would accept live channel catfish by appointment, but only when the fish met a usable size range and the load reached a minimum weight. A restaurant in Greensboro agreed to examine samples later in the season. 2 churches regularly held fundraising fish fries, yet neither would advertise an event until Denise could promise exact pounds and a delivery date. She had potential customers, not orders. Marcus proposed a 1-season grow-out trial using the existing pond outside processing and no expansion. Success would mean positive cash flow after direct expenses, not a large business or a flattering sales total. Denise presented the plan to Ray at the kitchen table. He listened as she explained the market, the risks, and the spending limit she intended to follow. "You don't own an aerator that runs," he said. "You don't know how many fish survived, and your buyers haven't bought anything." Denise admitted every point. Ray agreed to hold the land sale until the season ended, provided she used none of their shared tax money, and showed him every receipt. After he left, Denise searched the equipment shed and uncovered the frame of her father's old paddle wheel aerator beneath a tarp. The paddles were rusted, but intact. The motor was dead, and the gearbox would not turn. Denise carried the paddle wheel frame to Amos Bell's workshop on a flatbed trailer. Amos had raised catfish for 27 years before selling his ponds, and he inspected the machine without enthusiasm. The gearbox could be rebuilt, he said, but the motor bearings, wiring, and safety disconnect all needed replacement. Even after that, one paddle wheel would not make the pond foolproof. Denise needed an oxygen meter, a backup aerator, and enough fuel to run equipment through a power failure. Amos asked how many fish were in the pond, their average weight, and how much feed she planned to use. Denise could answer none of those questions with confidence. "Free fish are only free until they start breathing your oxygen," he told her. He advised her to let the hatchery problem become someone else's loss, then reminded her that commercial ponds could look healthy at sunset and become graveyards before dawn. Denise showed him Ray's deadline and the cost sheet she had built. She was not asking Amos to believe in a new fish farm. She was asking him to help determine whether one controlled season was possible. He finally agreed to rebuild the aerator if Denise paid for parts and followed measurements rather than instinct. Marcus arranged weekly fish samples and lent her an older dissolved oxygen meter. Ray signed a written spending limit and warned that exceeding it would end the experiment. As Denise left Amos's shop, he called after her, "When those fish stop eating, don't assume they're full. Sometimes they're telling you the water is failing." The rebuilt paddle wheel returned to the pond 3 days later. Amos installed it near the deeper eastern bank and replaced the cracked electrical line running from the old service pole. He also showed Denise how to connect a tractor-powered aerator if the electric unit failed, though she did not yet own the proper shaft or enough hose to position it safely. Marcus helped her divide the pond into monitoring points and set a conservative feeding schedule based on estimated biomass. Denise recorded temperature, oxygen feed, weight, weather, and fish behavior in her father's old ledger. Amos watched her first feeding and frowned when the surface erupted with small mouths. To Denise, the response looked like proof that the fish were hungry and healthy. To Amos, it only proved that the most aggressive fish had found the feed. He told her not to increase the ration until the next sample confirmed weight gain. Around town, people had already heard about the abandoned fingerlings. Someone at the feed store called Denise's pond the most expensive rescue tank in Hale County, and Ray repeated the joke when he delivered a tax notice. Denise ignored both of them. For 6 days, the fish consumed nearly every floating pellet within minutes. The stronger the feeding response became, the more convinced she was that the original schedule was too cautious. She added half a bag on the 7th day, then another half the day after that. To control electricity costs, she ran the paddle wheel only from midnight until shortly before dawn. By the end of the week, the pond had turned a rich green. Denise saw productive water. Amos saw a warning she had not yet learned to read. The heat settled over Hale County without wind. Afternoon temperatures pushed toward 100 degrees, and the surface of Denise's pond felt warm against her hand. Marcus advised reducing feed until the weather changed, but Denise had already promised the restaurant owner that she would bring a sample before the end of summer. Every week, saved on growth, seemed valuable. The fish still rushed to the feeding area, so she continued the higher ration. At sunset, the pond appeared alive and productive. The water carried a dense green bloom, and the fingerlings struck floating pellets so aggressively that some landed against the bank. Denise entered the full amount in her ledger and congratulated herself for wasting almost nothing. That night, she shut the paddle wheel off for several hours after calculating the electricity cost. She intended to restart it at midnight, but exhaustion from repairing cattle fence caused her to sleep through the alarm. Shortly before dawn, a faint splashing sound woke her. At the pond, thousands of fish were crowded near the surface, their mouths opening and closing in the dim light. Others gathered around the small stream entering from the upper ditch. Denise threw feed onto the water, thinking hunger had brought them up, but no fish struck it. Marcus answered his phone on the second ring and told her to start every source of aeration immediately. The paddle wheel turned, then slowed. As the old motor overheated, a breaker tripped. Denise reset it, but the machine stopped again after only minutes. Along the western bank, the first fingerlings rolled sideways, pale bellies flashing in the rising light. Amos reached the farm with his tractor and PTO aerator, while Denise was still trying to restart the paddle wheel. He backed to the bank, connected the shaft, and drove the spinning paddles into the pond. Brown water surged across the surface, drawing fish toward the oxygenated current, but the far end of the pond remained almost still. Denise and Ray used long-handled nets to remove dead fish before they sank. By mid-morning, several hundred lay in barrels beneath a tarp, and more floated among the weeds. The smell of warm water and decaying feed clung to their clothes. Ray did not need to say he had warned her. His silence was worse. A neighbor stopped on the county road and recorded the pond with his phone, announcing that the free fish fortune had lasted less than 2 weeks. Owen refused Denise's request to take the survivors back. The hatchery's health records no longer covered fish raised in an outside pond, and no buyer would accept them without new testing. Denise opened her ledger and saw how clearly she had caused the crisis. She had increased feed without a reliable population estimate, ignored Marcus's weather warning, and reduced aeration to protect a profit that did not yet exist. When Marcus arrived, his meter showed critically low oxygen in the shallow western half. He took depth readings across the pond and compared them with the old 5-acre estimate. Years of accumulated sediment had reduced the average depth far more than anyone expected. Denise had been managing the pond as though it contained substantially more water. The fish were not living in the system she had calculated. They were living in a smaller, warmer, more heavily loaded one. Marcus and Amos reconstructed the failure at Denise's kitchen table. The fingerlings had arrived, stressed, and no one knew the exact survival count. Yet Denise had calculated feed from the hatchery's original number. The dense algae bloom produced oxygen in daylight but consumed it after dark, while uneaten feed and organic matter added further demand. Because the pond was shallower than expected, the warm water held less oxygen and offered less volume to absorb the load. The lowest point came just before sunrise, precisely when Denise's aerator was off, and the motor failed. Marcus did not promise that the remaining fish could still make money. He said only that the cause was measurable and could be corrected. Denise cut the ration, removed spoiled feed from the shallows, and began checking dissolved oxygen before dawn, rather than relying on afternoon readings. Amos rebuilt the motor cooling system, replaced the breaker, and helped her assemble a PTO backup using borrowed equipment. Weekly samples would estimate average weight and survival, allowing feed to follow actual biomass. Denise entered every dead fish repair gallon of diesel and lost bag of feed into the ledger before showing it to Ray. The projected margin had narrowed sharply. Ray agreed not to end the trial immediately because she had stopped defending her mistake and started measuring it. But he drew a line beneath the remaining budget. "When that money is gone, we sell the lower ground," he said. Denise accepted the condition. The second attempt would have fewer fish, less feed, and no room for another night of guessing. For the next 6 weeks, Denise treated the pond like a system instead of a promise. She checked dissolved oxygen before sunrise, weighed feed instead of pouring by sight, and reduced the ration whenever the water darkened or the fish responded slowly. Once a week, Marcus and Amos helped net a small sample from different areas of the pond. Denise weighed each fish, recorded the range, and adjusted her estimate of the living biomass. The numbers improved gradually. Mortality fell to ordinary levels. The repaired paddle wheel ran without overheating, and the fish gained weight, even though Denise was feeding less than before the oxygen crash. She learned that withholding feed during dangerous weather did not ruin growth. It protected the water that made growth possible. Amos stopped calling the project a rescue and began asking to see her ledger before offering advice. Ray remained cautious, but he could no longer point to fresh losses every time he visited. A sample sent through the processor showed no obvious health problem, and the Greensboro restaurant owner agreed to inspect a small group when the fish approached market size. Denise felt the first real movement toward revenue. During the next sampling, however, Marcus placed 3 fish side by side on the measuring board. One was nearly ready for market, another was several ounces behind, and the smallest looked as though it belonged to a different shipment. The average weight was rising, but the average concealed a widening problem. Denise arranged the restaurant inspection anyway, believing a few more weeks of feeding would close the gap. Denise and Amos pulled a short section of seine through the feeding area on the morning the restaurant owner arrived. The fish were active and clean, but the moment they reached the sorting table, the problem became impossible to hide. Some had grown into thick, marketable catfish. Others were still too small for the processor's preferred line, while a few larger fish exceeded the portion size the restaurant used for plated meals. The owner weighed several at random and shook his head. He liked the appearance of the fish, but he could not build a weekly menu around loads that required constant sorting. "I need a product, Denise, not a pond full of possibilities," he told her. The 2 churches gave similar answers. They would consider buying for fundraising fish fries only after Denise could promise exact pounds, a dependable processing date, and consistent fillet sizes. Ray watched the rejected sample return to the pond and said the hatchery had discarded the fingerlings for the same reason the buyers were now refusing them. Denise had assumed that enough time and feed would make every fish equal. Marcus showed her the sampling records instead. The larger fingerlings had maintained their advantage, consumed more feed, and continued pulling away from the smaller group. Waiting longer might increase total weight, but it would also raise electricity, use feed costs, and oxygen demand. Before Denise could decide what to change, the weather forecast warned of several days above 100 degrees, with unusually still nights. The pond had recovered from one oxygen disaster, but the most dangerous weather of the season was approaching. The heat arrived under a sky without clouds or wind. Denise ran the paddle wheel longer each night and reduced feeding, but the water remained warm, even after sunset. On the third evening, a thunderstorm formed west of the farm without bringing rain. A heavy limb broke from an oak beside the service line and pulled the electrical wire down in the pasture. Denise did not discover the outage until she stepped outside after midnight and realized the paddle wheel had gone silent. At the pond, fish were already gathering near the surface. She started the tractor, connected the PTO aerator, and backed it into position while calling Amos. The machine threw a strong current across one end of the pond, but the fuel gauge sat below 1/4. Denise found only 2 small diesel cans in the equipment shed. Local stations were closed, and the farm supplier could not deliver before morning. She called Ray after staring at his number for nearly a minute. He arrived 40 minutes later with a transfer tank in his truck. "This is the last emergency I finance without a customer on paper," he said as they filled the tractor. Denise did not argue. She, Ray, and Amos worked through the night, moving the aerator slightly to spread oxygen and clearing weeds that wrapped around the shaft. Fish crowded into the moving water and several died in the still western corner, but the main group remained upright. Each oxygen reading rose briefly, then slipped again. The tractor could keep turning only as long as the diesel held, and the machinery survived until daylight. By sunrise, cooler air and the first faint breeze eased the pressure on the pond. The PTO aerator had run continuously, and most of the fish survived. Though Denise collected another barrel of losses from the far bank, an electrician repaired the damaged line that afternoon, but the bill, diesel, and lost fish cut deeper into the remaining budget. The emergency revealed what Denise had avoided, admitting one electric aerator was not a system. It was a single point of failure. She installed a power loss alarm, kept the tractor fueled, and wrote a backup checklist beside the pond ledger. Ray reviewed the new expenses and asked for a final financial projection. If the fish could not produce positive cash flow after processing and transport, he intended to resume the land sale as soon as the season ended. Denise could no longer afford to wait for every fish to reach the same size. While rebuilding the numbers, she sorted the weekly sample weights into separate columns instead of averaging them together. 3 distinct groups appeared. The largest group had reached market range weeks earlier, a middle group was approaching it, and the smallest fish still required considerable time. Denise realized she had been feeding the entire pond to improve the slowest group while carrying the oxygen risk created by the largest one. Selling the ready fish would reduce biomass, lower feeding pressure, and create revenue before the budget disappeared. The difficulty was that no buyer wanted a mixed catch. She needed a way to remove only the marketable fish while returning the smaller ones alive. Marcus studied the chart and said, "You don't need one harvest, you need the first of several." Marcus proposed a partial harvest, followed by immediate grading at the pond bank. Fish within the processor's target range would leave that day. The undersized group would return to the pond, and unusually large fish could be separated for buyers with different needs. The plan accepted the fingerling's unevenness, instead of spending more money trying to erase it. Denise contacted the processor, who agreed to reserve a limited receiving window if she could deliver enough live weight. The Greensboro restaurant and both churches remained interested, but only after seeing the graded results. Amos warned that partial harvesting an old pond was harder than the plan sounded. A seine had to stay tight against the bottom, and nobody knew what decades of sediment concealed beneath the surface. Denise searched county records and found an old pond construction sketch filed when her father improved the drain. It showed a collection trench running toward a deep harvest pocket near the outlet. That depression was now buried beneath years of soft mud and did not appear on the modern surface. Fish could retreat into it or slip beneath the seine if the crew pulled from the wrong direction. Marcus and Amos compared the old drawing with Denise's depth measurements and marked 3 possible net routes. The shortest route offered the best control but crossed the edge of the hidden trench. The safer route required more people, a longer net, and equipment Denise did not own. Processor fees, transportation, and market prices left room for only one costly mistake. Before Denise could schedule the harvest, she needed to map the bottom accurately and prove the first sale could still leave money after every expense already recorded. Denise spent 2 mornings mapping the pond before risking another net. Marcus rowed a small aluminum boat while she lowered a weighted line at marked intervals, and Amos recorded the depth, mud thickness, and every place the weight struck wood or metal. The old harvest trench still existed, but years of sediment had narrowed it into a soft channel leading toward the outlet. Near the deepest pocket, they found the remains of a feeder base capable of lifting a seine off the bottom. Amos proposed starting from the shallow end, keeping the lead line ahead of the fish, and using a second net to block the trench before the main pull closed. Denise then called the processor and demanded exact figures for receiving processing transport losses and payment timing. She added those costs to feed electricity, diesel repairs, equipment rental, and documented mortality. The result was uncomfortable but clear. The season could still finish with positive cash flow if the first harvest produced enough market-size fish and the smaller group returned to the pond with limited losses. The restaurant and both churches signed simple purchase commitments based on processed pounds, not promises. Ray reviewed the worksheet and checked Denise's arithmetic twice. 1 week pull and this goes negative, he said. Amos gave them an even harder limit. The fish could tolerate 1 unsuccessful gathering, and 1 final pull before heat crowding and handling stress made continued work unsafe. Denise booked the processor's earliest morning slot. From that moment, every person, net tank, and vehicle had to move on schedule. The evening before harvest, Denise arranged the pond bank like the receiving area of the school kitchen she once managed. The rented seine was stretched out and inspected for holes. 2 oxygenated hauling tanks were filled, tested, and shaded. A smaller blocking net waited beside the outlet, while grading baskets and certified scales stood beneath a temporary canopy. Amos checked the tractor, PTO, aerator, and backup generator. Marcus prepared water quality equipment and a plan for returning undersized fish without leaving them crowded in shallow tubs. The restaurant sent its kitchen manager to observe the grading, and representatives from both churches came to confirm the weights that would determine their fish fry dates. Ray agreed to record every pound and expense, but reminded Denise that a successful morning would not erase the losses already in the ledger. Before sunrise, dissolved oxygen measured safely and the crew entered the water. Amos directed the first end of the seine along the shallow western bank, while Denise kept tension from shore. Their plan was to drive the fish away from the old trench and close the net before they reached the harvest pocket. For the first 100 feet, the lead line dragged cleanly across the bottom. Then it struck buried debris and shuddered. Amos freed it, but the delay allowed the school to turn toward deeper water. Denise saw the surface darken near the outlet. "Close the blocking net now," she shouted. The crew moved into position, unaware that one edge of the main seine had already begun riding above the soft mud. The first pull closed with far less weight than anyone expected. When the crew brought the seine into the shallows, it held only a small group of frightened fish and several pounds of branches. The restaurant manager looked toward the pond as though the projected inventory had been imaginary. Amos examined the muddy lead line and found the cause. At the edge of the old trench, it had sunk into soft sediment, caught on the feeder base, and then lifted several inches. Most of the fish had escaped beneath it into the deep harvest pocket. The captured fish were already showing handling stress, so Marcus moved them into oxygenated water and warned that the next attempt had to be the last. Amos wanted to postpone the harvest and redesign the pull, but missing the processor appointment would cost Denise the receiving fee and possibly her buyers. She studied the depth map and realized they had treated the trench as something to avoid. Instead, they needed to use it as the final collection point. Denise reversed the route. The blocking net would be set across the far side of the pocket first, and the main seine would make a shorter pull from the opposite bank, pushing fish into a controlled enclosure before crossing the buried obstruction. Amos considered the current, the bottom contours, and the available daylight, then agreed. The crew reset both nets, while the aerator kept water moving through the pond. On the second pull, The lead line stayed on firm bottom. As the enclosure narrowed, the surface began to churn, with more catfish than the first net had suggested were still alive. The second seine gathered a dense school into the shallow enclosure without crossing the feeder base. Marcus slowed the crew before the fish became overcrowded, and grading began immediately. Undersized catfish were counted by sample, released through a water-filled chute, and returned to the pond. The market group went into oxygenated hauling tanks, while a smaller number of oversized fish were separated for a different order. The restaurant manager selected random fish from several baskets and confirmed that the graded group fell within the promised range. Ray recorded live weight as each container crossed the scale. By the time the truck left, Denise had enough fish to meet the processor's minimum without emptying the pond or forcing small fish into an unsuitable sale. The load arrived inside the receiving window and passed inspection. That afternoon, the processor confirmed the usable yield, allowing the restaurant and churches to finalize their orders. Denise returned home and opened the ledger with Ray. She subtracted feed, electricity, diesel repairs, equipment, rental transportation processing, and the value of documented losses. The remaining amount was modest, but it was positive. More importantly, removing the largest fish had reduced the pond's biomass, lowering daily feed use and oxygen demand for the group left behind. Ray studied the final figure and said one sale did not make the operation secure. Denise agreed. Then her phone rang twice, first with confirmation of a church fish fry order, then with a request from the restaurant for another graded delivery. For the first time, her future sales were attached to pounds and dates instead of hope. Denise completed 2 smaller partial harvests before cool weather slowed the fish. Neither produced a dramatic fortune. After every direct expense, the season generated enough cash to cover the property taxes, insurance part of the cattle feed bill, and a permanent power loss alarm for the pond. The remaining catfish continued growing at a lower density, giving Denise inventory for the following spring without buying another full load of fingerlings. Ray withdrew the lower acreage from sale after reviewing the complete ledger. He did not claim the pond had solved every financial problem, but the land had produced documented income without a major loan or the sale of the cattle herd. Denise kept the operation limited to 1 pond and continued using the outside processor. She refused suggestions to stock more heavily until she could afford independent backup power and improve the old harvest area. Amos began meeting other pond owners at Denise's farm, where he showed them the oxygen records, the failed feeding schedule, and the net route that had nearly ruined harvest day. Owen's hatchery also changed its procedure for canceled orders, requiring a confirmed destination before loaded trucks left the facility. Before dawn on the first morning of the next season, Ray stood beside Denise as the paddle wheel started automatically. He looked across the water and admitted he had once seen only 16,000 unwanted fish consuming money. Denise corrected him. The fish had never been the business. The business was knowing how much water could support which fish were ready, what buyers required, and whether anything remained after every bill was paid.